A lot of people don't realize that the Ukraine-Russia conflict dates back way longer than just 2014 when they invaded Crimea. They've had this tangled relationship of conflict, of joining together, of separating, of conflict again. They've had this like cyclical cycle because they were in the USSR, and then even before that, dating back to the early 1900s, and actually dating back all the way to about the 1620s or early 1600s. So I just did this like in-depth analysis of this conflict and the history of it. So I just wanted to go through it with you guys here. So yeah, the relationship between Ukraine and Russia, it's been this intertwined relationship for more than a century. They have shared heritage, imperial domination, revolutionary upheaval, ideological conflicts, and now it's a modern geopolitical rivalry. Well, it's more than that. It's a brutal war. I think it was the start of World War III. I mean, we're in 2026 right now, and we have hardcore, like the most terrifying trench warfare there has ever been in human history happening right now. You have drone operators dug out in trenches, operating FPV drones, operating Mavics, like operating all these different drone types, hunting guys in other trenches. It's insane. You still have artillery, you have all the components of trench warfare, and then you have FPV drones, and there's actually clips of FPV drones going into the trenches, following the trench line, going into a trench bunker or a trench door, exactly like how trenches were made during World War I. It's just insane that this is going on right now, and it doesn't get the international press has moved on from it. Like it's a fad when it's most likely the start of World War III. Going back to this, from the twilight of the Russian Empire in the 1900s, Ukraine was actually largely under Tsarist authority. But at its core, Ukraine and Russia have this like fundamental tension. They've had a fundamental tension for a long time throughout, I think, both of their histories. It's this weird extension of culture, political spheres, articulated through historical claims tracing back to the medieval Kievan Rus, the first East Slavic state, as common origin. That's where they think this relationship began between Russia and Ukraine. And then that's contrasted now with Ukraine's need and want to assert itself as a distinct nation. Let's go into it. Imperial Russia, 1900s through 1917. So at the dawn of the 20th century, Ukraine was firmly embedded within the Russian Empire, a vast multi-ethnic domain where Ukrainian lands were divided administratively into regions. So there was like Little Russia, but it was all unified under the absolute rule of Tsar, a form of absolute monarchy, creating a framework where local identities were subordinate to overreaching imperial structures. The empire's Russification policies, which had intensified in the late 19th century following earlier decrees, sought to erode Ukrainian culture distinctiveness by systematically promoting Russian language, customs, and administration as the norm, thereby integrating Ukrainians more fully into the Russian fold and diminishing any sense of separate nationality. So you actually see this throughout Ukraine's history, and even going on right now in Ukraine with this war with Russia. But so in the 1900s, the use of Ukrainian in schools and publications was strictly restricted. That's a common theme throughout Ukraine's history, throughout Russia's history. Right now, there's some of it's lies, some of it's propaganda, but there was some girls recently supposedly arrested for using Russian language in Ukraine or promoting this Russian music in Ukraine. And they weren't really arrested like how people in the UK are arrested for social media posts. They were arrested for just kind of promoting it, and I don't even think they were arrested. I think the authorities just went and talked to them and was like, hey, let's promote Ukrainian stuff. But you'll see that Russia is banning Ukrainian right now, like they did in literally the 1900s, like the year 1900. They banned Ukrainian, and in 2026, they're banning Ukrainian over in the Donbass region. This one is from February 3rd, 2026. In these regions that Russia has taken over, all on this eastern front, they banned Ukrainian entirely. They've taken over schools in this area, along the front in Russia as well. There's a recent documentary that came out documenting the progression of these Russian schools along the front and along these regions going through a militarization process. And it's really fascinating. But yeah, so in 1900, they banned Ukraine. In 2026, they banned Ukrainian as a language. And there's some weird beef there between Russian language and Ukrainian language. So this culture suppression bred deep resentment among Ukrainian intellectuals at that time, early 1900s. I try to talk a little bit about the Russian perspective, but mainly in this piece, in this article, I keep it on the Ukrainian. But so Ukraine's fertile black soil regions made it the empire's breadbasket, which it still is today, or was before the war, contributing massively to grain production and exports that fueled Russia's economy. But this came at the expense of local peasants who endured serf-like conditions. They were treated super poorly, even decades after early 1900s. In 1861, there was emancipation reforms in Ukraine, which freed the serfs, but left land ownership skewed toward the Russian elites. So the oligarchs maintained control while the serfs were freed from slavery, but they still worked the farms. And that actually happened. That happens throughout history, throughout where there's slaves and throughout where slaves are freed. That happened in the South in America. The slaves were all freed, but they had nowhere to go. They have no money. So are they really free? And then going back into this, industrialization of eastern regions like the Donbass brought waves of Russian workers, deliberately diluting Ukrainian demographics and creating Russo enclaves that would later complicate independence effort. When Putin's talking about like Ukraine is a part of Russia, the Russian people in Ukraine, it's because they bust them in by horse and wagon in the early 1900s after the emancipation reforms in 1861 to dilute the Ukrainian workers and bring in Russian people to populate the lands and work to further degrade Ukrainians. In 1917, there was the Russian Revolution, which shattered the empire's cohesion, and it created a political vacuum in Ukraine where Ukraine sought to assert its autonomy. So in 1917, this is when Ukraine really sought to become autonomous from the Russian regime, from the Russian oligarchs. Following the revolution that toppled Tsar Nicholas II and established a provisional government in Kiev composed of Ukrainian socialists, intellectuals, and nationalists in March 1917 as a provisional authority proclaiming Ukraine's People Republic, the UNR, in June of that year, initially as an autonomous entity within a federated democratic Russia. This is when the Bolsheviks was happening, led by Vladimir Lenin in Russia. They again, like the West is doing now with BlackRock and all these corporate powers on the Western side of things, and Russia on the Eastern side of things, they're viewing this like they did in 1918, viewed Ukraine's vast resources for grain, coal, and manpower as vital for the success of their Soviet project. So the Bolsheviks believe in order to feed their people, in order to have enough workers, they need Ukraine. And right now, this is all over the same things. Grain, coal, manpower. Russia believes that it needs Ukraine, it needs control of it. And there is, when they talk about the security aspect of it, with the West encroaching on Ukraine, that is also very true. So it's nothing is black and white, everything is super gray. And that's not justifying Russia's move at all, that's just stating that they have these reasons, just like the Bolsheviks did or the West does. The West wants Ukraine because it's a breadbasket as well. They want control of the food supply and the control of the land. So in 1918, the UNR signed a treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918 with Germany and Austria-Hungary, securing temporary independence and military aid in exchange for food supplies desperately needed by the war-weary Germans from World War I. And that pact highlighted Ukraine's willingness to align with any power that offered it recognition. But again, this treaty was ultimately broken by the Central Powers' defeat in World War I later that year. So this was March 1918, they were going to give food to the Germans to help their war effort. And then the war ended, the Central Powers were defeated, and that treaty was broken. And this is, again, a constant theme in Ukraine's history. All these treaties are broken. Ukraine tries to align itself with the West. We break the treaties. And then all these timelines kind of reveal chaos of time. As by 1918, Ukraine endured multiple invasions from Bolshevik Red forces seeking to incorporate it into their revolution, White Russian monarchs aiming to restore the empire, Polish armies expanding westward, and even anarchist forces under Nestor Makhno, who controlled southern territories with their own anti-authoritarian agenda. So there was just this multi-front war in Ukraine, just pure chaos from everywhere, and it drained resources and lives. And from this Ukrainian perspective, there was a heroic but doomed struggle for self-determination. This period was a valiant attempt to build a nation state amid overwhelming odds. It just shows how strong the Ukrainian people are. And during this period, their troops were just super disorganized in this lawless environment. This period, 1917 to 1921, kind of ended with the Treaty of Riga, signed between Poland and Soviet Russia, which partitioned Ukrainian lands between the two powers. So these two countries sign a treaty over a country that's not even theirs and say, hey, well, let's split this up. Western regions given to Poland and eastern regions given to the Soviets, breaking any promises of the UNR sovereignty treaty that they signed earlier, and extinguishing the fragile republic, but it didn't destroy the spirit of independence that Ukraine has and the Ukrainian people had, because that's a constant theme throughout Ukraine's history as well. 1921 to 1990, there was this kind of like Soviet gap where Ukraine was incorporated into the Soviet Union as the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, UKRSSR, in 1922. This marked this weird uneasy phase of Ukraine's history, and initially under Vladimir Lenin's leadership, there was this indigenization process in the 1920s that actually promoted Ukrainian language and culture as a means to consolidate Bolshevik power by appealing to these local populations, leading to this weird, brief cultural renaissance, which was kind of beautiful. And it's where Ukraine became Ukrainian. This language was the language of administration and education, and it fostered cultural renaissance of literature, art, and scholarships that like helped rejuvenate the native tongue of Ukraine. But all that actually ended and shifted dramatically under Joseph Stalin. They call it the Iron Rule, and started in the late 1920s going to the 1930s. And there was this strict paranoia, this like deep paranoia about Ukraine and their nationalism. And it led to a engineered famine called the Holodomor famine. And it resulted in the deaths of millions. Ranges estimating from 3.5 to 7 million Ukrainians died from starvation. To give you some context, during World War II, only 400,000 US soldiers died. There was about 1 million casualties, 1 million people injured, and then about 400,000 of them died from their wounds in battle. So there was an engineered famine in Ukraine that killed 3.5 to 7 million Ukrainians because they were Ukrainians and want their own nation. There's this theme throughout history that these people who rise into power are just so brutally power hungry that they will do anything. Human lives don't mean anything. Going into World War II, Ukraine was also invaded by the Nazis in June of 1941, part of Operation Barbarossa. Saw some Ukrainians in Western regions. Initially, they welcomed German forces as liberators from the Stalinist oppression, and it led to controversial collaborations such as those by the Organization of the Ukrainian Nationalists, who sought to exploit the chaos for independence but ended up clashing with both Soviets and Nazis. Which is like, of course, your 7 million people were just killed by an engineered famine from your current rulers. And the Nazis roll in. Of course, you're probably going to celebrate them at first because you don't know what they're about. So man, Ukraine's history is rough. It's brutal. This war, the World War II, brought unimaginable horrors to Ukraine, including the Holocaust, where over 1.5 million Ukrainian Jews were massacred, Babin Yar near Kiev, and widespread forced labor and executions that claimed millions more lives, and it reshaped Ukraine's society again through destruction and displacement. Post-war, Stalin deported entire ethnic groups such as the Crimean Tatars in 1944, accused of collaboration with the Nazis, which further altered demographics, forcibly relocated hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians and ethnic groups, the Crimean Tatars, to Central Asia in cattle cars. So it just doesn't stop. Ukraine's history is brutal, and it is a country that is faced by constant war, constant struggle to just claim itself, say, hey, we're independent, we are Ukrainians, this is our country. It's kind of been unable to do that for a prolonged period. It's not kind of, it's a fact. It's been unable to do that for a prolonged period. After World War II, in 1954, Nikita Khrushchev transferred Crimea to the USSR as a symbolic gesture marking the 300th anniversary Pereslov Agreement, a move now bitterly contested in modern conflicts, such as the evidence from the Soviet border drawing. And in 2014, Russia went in and took Crimea, so it doesn't stop. In 1970s, there was a rise of dissident movements under leaders like Chernobyl, who documented human rights abuses and advocated for cultural rights of Ukrainians, challenging the Russification of Ukraine, that prioritized Russian language in education and media. So you see that theme again popping up in the after World War II, 1950 to 1960, 1970s, Russia was prioritizing Russian in Ukraine as opposed to Ukrainian. So they took over the schools, they were teaching Russian, they weren't teaching Ukrainian. Media, the news, the radios at the time, this was in the 70s, were Russian, state-ran, and Ukrainian wasn't really allowed. That takes us into 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, which exposed Soviet mismanagement and disproportionately affected Ukraine, leading to this widespread health crisis and environmental devastation. Really brought the public together in outrage of just Soviet mishandling, which it takes us into 1991, which was the collapse of the Soviet Union and birthed the independent Ukraine through a resounding 90% vote in December of that year. So December of 91, Ukraine is finally independent. But then that comes with its own issues. That comes with, economic interdependencies, border negotiations, growing tensions as Ukraine navigated its sovereignty while Russia grappled with the loss of its empirical core. I'm sure there was fraud and corruption going on back then, especially with such a new breakaway. You probably still have people who are secretly aligned with the Soviets. The USSR left 1,800 nuclear warheads in Ukraine, and this led to the 1994 Budapest Memorandum signed by Ukraine, Russia, US, and the UK. For whatever reason, whatever pressures were put on the people in power then, Ukraine agreed to denuclearization in exchange for security assurances respecting its territorial integrity, and the treaty promised non-aggression, economic cooperation, and then it was broken by Russia in 2014. So to break that down a little bit, Russia, US, UK all agreed if Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons that they would protect Ukraine, which obviously didn't happen. And I'm sure there were some reasons for that. The US and the UK were probably like, hey, the West will help you. The West will provide economic support, provide industry, will provide corporations to move in, but you just have to give up your nuclear weapons because we can't just have a new nation with the third largest arsenal of nuclear weapons out there. So just give them up and we'll take care of you, and we'll protect you if anyone ever invades you again. And then in 2014, Russia invaded Ukraine and took Crimea. It's just an insane move that the US just throughout history has forced people to give up their nuclear weapons for all these promises, and it doesn't abide by them. So jumped ahead a little bit there, going back to USSR collapsing. So there was in 1997, a Russia-Ukraine friendship treaty where Russia agreed to formally recognize borders and committed to cooperation. And then there was a dispute in 2003 called the Tuzla Island Crisis in the Kerch Strait, where Russia attempted to build a dam claiming territorial rights, signaling the underlying frictions over shared water and resources. In 2004, there was an armed revolution sparked by widespread protests against rigged presidential elections favoring the pro-Russian Viktor Yanukovych and installed the pro-Western Viktor Yushchenko, straining relations with Moscow as it highlighted Ukraine's internal East-West divide and Russia's use of energy leverage such as the 2009 gas dispute. This 2004 armed revolution is actually really interesting. There was rigged elections and a pro-Russian person was elected, and then the revolution happened and a pro-Western person was put into power. And I think that's probably kind of typical of what the CIA was doing at that time. So I actually really want to dive into this. Maybe I'll do another analysis or article on this and try to highlight the CIA's role and the Western intelligence agency's role in Ukraine's history and how it probably led to some of this chaos. So in 2013, there was actually a Euromaidan revolution. It was this Viktor Yankovchiv's abrupt 2013 rejection of the EU association agreement under pressure from Russia. So it ignited these Euromaidan protests in Kiev's Independence Square. A mass movement evolved the demands for European integration to a broader revolution against corruption and authoritarianism, ultimately sparked the war by exposing deep fissures in Ukraine-Russia relations. So this Euromaidan revolution actually kind of led up to Russia taking Crimea. By March of 2014, Russia annexed Crimea using the unmarked Wagner group Little Green Men, and then hastily organized referendums widely dismissed as illegitimate, followed in April by separatist uprising in Donbass, which is the Azov Brigade. So spring of 2014, right after Russia annexed Crimea, put in these illegitimate laws. This Donbass war and this annexation of Crimea from 2014 to 2022 to full-scale invading Ukraine. This war started in 2014. Trench warfare was taking place, ceasefire violations, failed diplomatic efforts that entrenched division and foreshadowed this full-scale invasion. But the Donbass war is super important because there was this weird invasion of the Wagner group of Crimea, but we have the Budapest Memorandum where Russia said they wouldn't do that. We don't really trust them. The US and the UK said, we'll protect you guys. And they didn't. The US, the UK, the EU, the West didn't really do anything at all when Russia took Crimea. There was this Minsk agreement in September 2014, and then there was another one in February 2015, brokered by Germany, France, Ukraine. Russia called for ceasefires and prisoner exchanges. Same thing you see going on now. Russia is using the same playbook, and the West is using the same playbook as well, where you make these treaties, you have these talks, nothing really happens. Russia was still shelling and in violation of all these peace agreements and treaties. So I'm sure the Ukrainian people are just so exhausted. They have been at war for centuries, for so long. In 2017, the US and NATO finally decided to provide aid. I'm sure they provided a little bit of aid, but this was a huge aid package that they decided, and it led to, it was non-lethal aid initially, and then it led to we finally providing Javelin anti-tank missiles in 2017, which fostered Ukrainian forces. This all led up to 2022, where there was this full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and they wanted to denazify Ukraine. You had that convoy going, right? And so the Russians were telling their people, the Russians were telling their military, hey, Ukraine wants to be liberated. In this convoy, it's been proven these Russian soldiers didn't think that they were gonna fight anyone. They thought they were gonna roll in, Ukraine was gonna celebrate them, that they came in to help them. They brought, there's reports they brought their dress clothes, bags of condoms, apparently, because they thought they were just gonna be these superheroes, that's what the Russian state was telling them. But then we saw there was that column that advanced towards Kiev, and it was just Ukraine stood up and fought, and the West actually united to help Ukraine, which is kind of insane. Like right now in Ukrainian people, along with, I'm not sure about now, but during Biden, there was U.S. Special Forces fighting alongside Ukrainian people. There's Polish forces, there's EU, NATO forces in Ukraine with Ukrainians fighting Russians. And who's fighting alongside the Russians? North Korea and China. So this seems like the beginning of World War III. It seems like this is a world war. This isn't a proxies where the CIA is funding the Taliban to fight whoever Russia is funding in the Middle East to fight Iranians in the Middle East. This isn't some weird proxy war. This is Russians fighting US soldiers. This is Russians, whether you say they're volunteers or not, there were reports of special forces in Ukraine fighting Russians on the front lines, fighting North Koreans, fighting Chinese. There's not really Chinese troops, but it's a lot of Chinese weapons. And I'm sure there is some Chinese help on the back end logistically with Russia, which it's been confirmed. But I mean like actual Chinese people in Russia supporting the war effort. Seems like a world war to me. You also have the US taking out Venezuela, taking out this this pro-Russian president in Venezuela. You have also these little conflicts and wars going on in Asia, in Burma, in Myanmar. There's little tufts between India and China over its border. There's all this weird stuff going on right now, which is, I believe, seems to be ramping up to a full-scale war. And if it's not already a full-scale war, it seems like it will go that way. I'll just touch on the casualties. Casualty reports are super hard to find. It's key, crucial information for the war effort. Russia and Ukraine don't really release numbers, but there's all these other organizations kind of tracking, and it's actually really difficult because there's both sides leave a lot of bodies on the front because you can't really recover bodies or people who are critically injured because there's FPV drones chasing them, they're getting RD'd, there's all this stuff going on. So Russia's approximately suffered about 1.2 million casualties. And so that's injured, that's deaths, that's everything combined. And I believe about 400,000 of those are deaths from all the research I've done and on the numbers I've seen, which is basically what the US had and lost in World War II. So super comparable to World War numbers for the Russian side. And the Ukrainian side, it's reported about half, so about 500,000 casualties, maybe 200,000 deaths. Those numbers on both sides, those numbers are probably actually much higher on both sides. So these are World War numbers that are comparable to casualties and death rates of World War II, of World War I, which is insane. As of right now in the war, there's a heightening Russian language to use nuclear weapons against the EU and NATO countries. So they actually deployed Orishnik missile, this like hypersonic missile that goes at 8,000 miles per hour. They deployed that from Belarus to Lviv, Ukraine, which is right next to Poland. That was kind of shocking. That was a message to the West, like, hey, we have these capabilities and you can't stop us. A little concerning, heightening the language. Russia right now is also targeting key infrastructure, key energy infrastructure in Ukraine to basically dismantle their power grid. They're trying to separate their power grid into isolated islands, eastern islands and western islands. Russia is targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure around the coldest times, of course, these rolling blackouts, which is causing the country of Ukraine to have full-scale rolling blackouts across the country, which is a country of 41 million people. So they are entering humanitarian crisis. This is causing apartment buildings to have full-scale blackouts, as well as a lot of their water pumps are electric. So a lot of people aren't able to actually get drinking water, and you can't even use water to bathe because it's 0 degrees Fahrenheit. These energy attacks are going on right now as of February 8, 2026